Welcome back. Today we have chapters 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7. This is Miss Franny telling about her bear story. Back when Florida was wild, when it consisted of nothing but palmetto trees and mosquitoes so big they could fly away with you, Miss Franny Block started in, and I was just a little girl, no bigger than you, my father, Herman Block, told me that I could have anything I wanted for my birthday. Anything at all. Miss Franny looked around the library. She leaned in close to me. I don't want to appear prideful, she said, but my daddy was a very rich man. A very rich man. She nodded and leaned back and said, and when I was a little girl who loved to read. So I told him, I said, Daddy, I would most certainly love to have a library for my birthday. A small little library would be wonderful. You asked for a whole library? A small one, Miss Franny nodded. I wanted a little house full of nothing but books, and I wanted to share them too. And I got my wish. My father built me this house, the very one we're sitting in now, and at a very young age, I became a librarian. Yes, ma'am. What about the bear? I said. Did I mention that Florida was wild in those days? Miss Franny Block said. You did. It was wild. There were wild men and wild women and wild animals. Like bears? Yes, ma'am, that's right. Now I have to tell you, I was a little Miss Know-it-all. I was a Miss Smarty Pants with my library full of books. Oh, yes, ma'am, I thought I knew the answers to everything. Well, one hot Thursday, I was sitting in my library with all the doors and windows open and my nose stuck in a book, when a shadow crossed the desk. And without looking up, yes, ma'am, without looking up, I said, is there a book I can help you find? Well, there was no answer. And I thought it might have been a wild man or a wild woman, scared of all the books and afraid to speak up. But then I became aware of a peculiar smell. A very strong smell. I raised my eyes slowly, and standing right in front of me was a bear. Yes, ma'am, a very large bear. How big? I asked. Oh, well, said Miss Franny, perhaps 3 times the size of your dog. Then what happened? I asked her. Well, said Miss Franny, I looked at him and he looked at me. He put his big nose up in the air and sniffed, as if he was trying to decide if a little Miss Know-it-all librarian what he was in the mood to eat. And I sat there, and then I thought, well, if this bear intends to eat me, I'm not going to let it happen without a fight. No, ma'am. So very slowly and very carefully, I raised up the book I was reading. What book was that? I asked. Why, it was War and Peace, a very large book. I raised it up slowly, and then I aimed it carefully, and I threw it right at the bear and screamed, "Begone!" And do you know what? No, ma'am, I said. He went. But this is what I'll never forget. He took the book with him. Nah, I said. Yes, ma'am, said Miss Franny. He snatched it up and ran. Did he come back? Nope, never saw him again. Well, the men in town used to tease me about it. They used to say, Miss Franny, we saw that bear of yours in the woods today, and he was reading that book. He said it was sure good, and would it be all right if he just kept it for just another week? Yes, ma'am, they did tease me about it, she sighed. I imagine I'm the only one left from those days. I imagine I'm the only one that even recalls that bear. All my friends, everyone I knew when I was young, they're all dead and gone. She sighed again. She looked sad and old and wrinkled. It was the same way I felt sometimes, being friendless in a new town and not having a mama to comfort me. I sighed too. Winn-Dixie raised his head off his paws and looked back and forth between me and Miss Franny. He sat then and showed Miss Franny his teeth. Well, now look at that, she said. That dog's smiling at me. It's a talent of his, I told her. Oh, it's a fine talent, said Miss Franny. A very fine talent. And she smiled back at Winn-Dixie. We could be friends, I said to Miss Franny. I mean, you and me and Winn-Dixie, we could all be friends. Miss Franny smiled even bigger. "Why, that would be grand," she said, "just grand." And right at that minute, right when the three of us had decided to be friends, who should come marching into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library but old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. She walked right up to Miss Franny's desk and said, "I finished Johnny Tremaine and I enjoyed it very much. I'd like something even more difficult to read now because I'm an advanced reader." "Oh, yes, dear, I know," said Miss Franny. She got up out of her chair. Amanda pretended like I wasn't there. She stared right past me. "Are dogs allowed in the library?" she asked Miss Franny as they walked away. "Certain ones," said Miss Franny, "a select few." She turned around and winked at me, and I smiled back. I just made my first friend in Naomi, and nobody was going to mess that up for me, not even old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. Chapter 8. Winn-Dixie's bald spot started growing fur, and the fur that he had to begin with started looking shiny and healthy, and he didn't limp anymore. And you could tell he was proud of looking so good, proud of not looking like a stray. I thought what he needed most was a collar and a leash. So I went into Gertrude's Pets, where there were fish and snakes and mice and lizards and gerbils and pet supplies, and I found a real handsome red leather collar with a matching leash. Winn-Dixie was not allowed to come inside the store. There was a big sign on the door that said, "No dogs allowed." So I held the collar and the leash up to the window, and Winn-Dixie, who was standing on the other side of the window, pulled up his lip and showed me his teeth and sneezed and wagged his tail something furious. So I knew he absolutely loved that leash and collar combination. But it was very expensive. I decided to explain my situation to the man behind the counter. I said, "I don't get a big fancy allowance to afford something this fancy, but I love this collar and leash, and so does my dog. And I was thinking maybe you could set me up on an installment plan." "Installment plan?" said the man. "Gertrude!" somebody screamed in a real irritating voice. I looked around. It was a parrot. She was sitting on top of the fish tanks looking right at me. "An installment plan," I said, ignoring the parrot. "You know, where I promise to give you my allowance every week and you give me the leash and the collar now." "Don't think I can do that," said the man. He shook his head. "No, the owner, she wouldn't like that." He looked down at the counter. He wouldn't look at me. He had thick black hair, and it was slicked back like Elvis Presley's. He had on a name tag that said, Otis. "Or I could work for you," I said. "I could come in and sweep floors and dust shelves and take out the trash. I could do that." I looked around Gertrude's Pets. There was sand and sunflower seed shells and big dust bunnies all over the floor. I could tell it needed to be swept. Said Otis. He looked down the counter some more. "Gertrude!" the parrot screamed again. "I'm real trustworthy," I said. "I'm new in town, but my daddy's the preacher. He's the preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. So I'm real honest. But the only thing is, Winn-Dixie, my dog, he would have to come inside with me, because if we get separated for too long, he starts to howl something terrible." "Gertrude doesn't like dogs," said Otis. "Is she the owner?" I asked. No, he finally looked up. He pointed at the fish tank. "That Gertrude, the parrot. I named her after the owner." "Gertrude's a pretty bird," screamed Gertrude. "She might like Winn-Dixie," I told Otis. "Almost everybody does. Maybe he could come inside and meet her, and if the two of them get along, then could I have a job?" "Maybe," Otis mumbled. He looked down at the counter again. So I went and opened the door, and Winn-Dixie came trotting on inside the door. Inside the store. "Dog!" screamed Gertrude. "I know it," Otis told her. And then Gertrude got real quiet. She sat on the top of the fish tank and cocked her head from one side to the other, looking at Winn-Dixie. And Winn-Dixie stood and stared back at her. He didn't hardly move. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't smile, and he didn't sneeze. He just stared at Gertrude, and she stared at him. And then she spread her wings out real far and flew and landed on top of Winn-Dixie's head. "Dog!" she croaked. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail just a tiny bit, and Otis said, You can start on Monday." "Thank you," I told him. "You won't be sorry." On the way out of Gertrude's Pets, I said to Winn-Dixie, "You're better at making friends than anybody I've ever known. I bet if my mama knew you, she'd think you were the best dog ever." Winn-Dixie was smiling up at me, and I was smiling down at him. And so neither one of us was looking where we were going, and we almost bumped right into Sweetie Pie Thomas. She was standing there sucking on the knuckle of her third finger, staring in the window of Gertrude's Pets. She took her finger out of her mouth and looked at me. Her eyes were all big and round. "Was that bird sitting on the dog's head?" she asked. She had her hair tied in a ponytail with a pink ribbon. But it wasn't much of a ponytail. It was mostly ribbon and a few strands of hair. "Yes," I told her. "I seen it," she said. She nodded her head and put her knuckle back in her mouth. Then she took it out real quick. "I seen that dog in church, too. He was catching a mouse. I want a dog just like it, but my mama won't let me get no dog. She says if I'm real good, I might get to buy a goldfish or one of them gerbils. That's what she said. Can I pet your dog?" "Sure," I told her. Sweetie Pie stroked Winn-Dixie's head so long and serious that his eyes drooped half closed and drool came out the side of his mouth. "I'm going to be 6 years old in September. I got to stop sucking on my knuckle once I'm 6, said Sweetie Pie. "I'm having a party. Do you want to come to my party? The theme is pink." "Sure," I told her. "Can this dog come?" she asked. "You bet," I told her. And all of a sudden I felt happy. I had a dog, I had a job, I had Miss Franny Block for a friend, and I had my first invitation to a party in Naomi. It didn't matter that it came from a 5-year-old and that the party wasn't until September. I didn't feel so lonely anymore. Chapter 9. Just about everything that happened to me that summer happened because of Winn-Dixie. For instance, without him, I would never have met Gloria Dump. He was the one who introduced us. What happened was this. I was riding my bike home from Gertrude's Pets, and Winn-Dixie was running alongside beside me. We went past Dunlap and Steve Dewberry's house, and when Dunlap and Stevie saw me, they got on their bikes and started following me. They wouldn't ride with me. They just rode behind me and whispered things that I couldn't hear. Neither of them had any hair on his head because their mama shaved their heads every week during the summer because of the one time that Dunlap got fleas in his hair from their cat, Sadie. And now they looked like two identical bald-headed babies, even though they weren't twins. Dunlap was 10 years old like me, and Stevie was 9 and tall for his age. "I can hear you," I hollered back at them. "I can hear what you're saying." But I couldn't. Winn-Dixie started to race way ahead of me. "You better watch out," Dunlap hollered. "That dog's headed right for the witch's house." "Winn-Dixie," I called. But he kept on going faster, and he hopped a gate and went into the most overgrown jungle of a yard that I have ever seen. "You better go get your dog out of there," Dunlap said. "The witch'll eat the dog," Stevie said. "Oh, shut up," I told him. I got off my bike and went up to the gate and hollered, "Winn-Dixie, you better come in and out of there." But he didn't. "She's probably eating him right now," Stevie said. He and Dunlap were standing behind me. "She eats dogs all the time." "Get lost, you bald-headed babies," I said. "Hey," said Dunlap, "that ain't a very nice way for a preacher's daughter to talk." He and Stevie backed up a little. I stood there and thought for a minute. I finally decided I was more afraid of losing Winn-Dixie than I was of having to deal with a dog-eating witch, so I went through the gate and into the yard. "That witch is going to eat the dog for dinner and you for dessert," Stevie said. "Well, tell the preacher what happened to you," Dunlap shouted after me. By then, I was deep in the jungle. There was every kind of thing growing everywhere. There were flowers and vegetables and trees and vines. "Winn-Dixie," I said. "Hey, hey, hey," I heard. "This dog sure likes to eat." I went around a really big tree that was all covered in moss, and there was Winn-Dixie. He was eating something right out of the witch's hand. She looked up at me. "This dog sure likes peanut butter," she said. "You can always trust a dog that likes peanut butter." She was old with crinkly brown skin. She had a big floppy hat with flowers all over it, and she didn't have any teeth. But she didn't look like a witch. She looked nice, and Winn-Dixie liked her, I could tell. "I'm sorry he got in your garden," I said. "You ain't got to be sorry," she said. "I enjoy a little company." "My name's Opal," I told her. "And my name is Gloria Dump," she said. "Ain't that a terrible last name, Dump?" "Well, my last name is Baloney," I said. "Sometimes the kids at school back home in Watley called me lunch meat." "Ah," Gloria Dump laughed. "What about this dog? What you call him?" "Winn-Dixie," I said. Winn-Dixie thumped his tail on the ground. He tried smiling, but it was hard with his mouth full of peanut butter. "Winn-Dixie?" Gloria Dump said. "You mean like the grocery store?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Woo-wee," she said. That takes the strange name prize, don't it?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I was just fixing to make myself peanut butter and sandwich," she said. "You want one too?" "All right," I said. "Yes, please." "Go on, sit down," she said, pointing at a lawn chair with the back all busted out of it. "But sit down careful." I sat down careful, and Gloria Dump made me a peanut butter sandwich on white bread. Then she made one for herself and put her false teeth in to eat it. When she was done, she said to me, "You know, my eyes ain't too good at all. I can't see nothing but the general shape of things, so I gotta rely on my heart. Why don't you go on and tell me everything about yourself so I can see you with my heart?" And because Winn-Dixie was looking up at her like she was the best thing he'd ever seen, and because the peanut butter sandwich had been so good, and because I'd been waiting for a long time to tell some person everything about me, I did.